Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning of October 15th, 2009 began like any other Thursday in the quiet mountain town of Asheville, North Carolina, except for one devastating difference. 17-year-old Autumn Parker had not come home the night before. Her untouched bed, still made with the same precision she always maintained, told a story that her parents were not yet ready to comprehend. The silence in her room felt different that morning, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves understood that something fundamental had shifted in the Parker household forever. Autumn Parker had always been the kind of daughter that other parents pointed to as an example. She maintained a perfect grade point average at Asheville High School, volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, and never missed her curfew. She sang in the church choir, participated in the debate team, and had already been accepted early decision to 3 prestigious universities. Her college essays sat in neat folders on her desk, each one a testament to her ambition and careful planning. Everything about Autumn's life appeared meticulously organized, from her color-coded planner to her carefully curated selection of college preparatory courses. She was, by all accounts, the perfect daughter living the perfect life in the perfect family. But perfection, as the Parker family would soon discover, often conceals the deepest cracks. The events leading up to Autumn's disappearance began innocuously enough. On the evening of October 14th, Autumn had finished dinner with her parents, Richard and Margaret Parker, at exactly 6:30, as was their custom. The meal had been pleasant, filled with the usual discussions about Autumn's upcoming college visits and her performance in the recent debate tournament. Margaret had made her daughter's favorite meal, chicken piccata with roasted vegetables, and Richard had been in particularly good spirits, having just received a promotion at the accounting firm where he worked. Everything seemed normal, routine even, which made what happened next all the more incomprehensible to those who loved Autumn most. At 7:15 that evening, Autumn had asked permission to meet her friend, Jessica Morrison, at the downtown coffee shop to work on a group project for their advanced placement English class. This was not an unusual request. Autumn often studied with friends, and Jessica had been her classmate since middle school. Margaret had reminded her daughter to be home by 10 o'clock, and Autumn had smiled, kissed both her parents on the cheek, and walked out the front door carrying her backpack full of textbooks and notebooks. She wore her favorite jeans, a gray hoodie with her school logo, and white sneakers. Her long brown hair had been pulled back in a ponytail, and she had applied just a touch of lip gloss, as she always did before going out. She looked like any other teenager heading out for an evening of studying with friends. That was the last time Richard and Margaret Parker saw their daughter. When 10 o'clock came and went without any sign of Autumn, Margaret began to worry. She called her daughter's cell phone repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. This was unusual. Autumn always answered her phone, always checked in with her parents, always respected the boundaries they had established. By 10:30, Richard had joined his wife in her concern, and they decided to drive to the coffee shop where Autumn had supposedly been studying. The drive through the quiet Asheville streets felt interminable, each passing minute adding weight to the growing sense of dread that had settled in Margaret's chest. When they arrived at the coffee shop, it was still open, filled with the usual assortment of students and local residents enjoying evening beverages and conversations. But Autumn was not there. Richard approached the counter and asked the barista, a young man with thick-rimmed glasses and an apron covered in coffee stains, if he had seen a teenage girl matching Autumn's description. The barista shook his head apologetically. He had been working since 3 that afternoon and had not seen anyone fitting that description. Margaret showed him a photo on her phone, her hands shaking as she held it up to the light. The barista studied it carefully, then shook his head again. No, he was certain he had not seen that girl all evening. The Parkers immediately called Jessica Morrison's house. When Jessica's mother answered the phone, the confusion in her voice was palpable. There was no group project, she informed them. Jessica had been home all evening working on her college applications. In fact, Jessica had not spoken to Autumn in several days, not since their last class together on Tuesday afternoon. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her daughter had lied to them. Autumn, who never lied, who always followed the rules, who prided herself on her honesty and integrity, had deliberately deceived them about her plans for the evening. Richard Parker called the Asheville Police Department at 11:07 that night. The dispatcher who took his call was professional, but not particularly alarmed. Teenage runaways were common, she explained in a calm voice that Richard would later remember as infuriatingly detached. Most of them returned home within 24 to 48 hours. The dispatcher suggested that the Parkers wait until morning before filing an official missing person report. Teenagers often lost track of time, she said. They went to parties, stayed out late with friends, made impulsive decisions. She advised the Parkers to call their daughter's friends, check social media, and wait to see if Autumn came home on her own. But Richard Parker knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, that parental instinct that defies logic and reason. He insisted on filing the report immediately, and after some back and forth, the dispatcher agreed to send an officer to their home to take the information. Officer Daniel Chen arrived at the Parker residence at 11:45, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of patient understanding that barely masked his skepticism. He had handled dozens of missing teenager cases, and the vast majority ended with sheepish kids returning home after a night of rebellion or poor judgment. Officer Chen asked the standard questions. Had Autumn been having problems at school? Had she been fighting with her parents? Was there a boyfriend in the picture? Had she been exhibiting any unusual behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance? Did she have access to money or credit cards? The Parkers answered each question with increasing frustration. No, there were no problems at school. No, they had not been fighting. No, there was no boyfriend that they knew of. Autumn's behavior had been completely normal, exactly as it always was. She had access to a debit card connected to an account with about $400 in it, money she had saved from birthday gifts, and her part-time job at the library. Officer Chen took notes, nodded sympathetically, and promised that the department would do everything possible to locate Autumn. He suggested that the Parkers get some rest, assured them that their daughter would probably turn up soon, and left them with his card and instructions to call if they heard anything. After he left, Richard and Margaret sat in their living room in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. Their perfect daughter, their carefully raised child, had vanished into the October night, and nobody seemed to understand the urgency of the situation except them. Sleep was impossible that night. Margaret sat in Autumn's room, running her hands over her daughter's belongings, searching for some clue, some explanation that might make sense of the incomprehensible. She opened Autumn's laptop, but it was password protected. She looked through the drawers of her daughter's desk, finding nothing but neatly organized school supplies and college information packets. She checked the closet, trying to determine if any clothes were missing, but Autumn had so many clothes that it was impossible to tell. Everything in the room spoke of a girl who had her life together, who knew exactly where she was going and how she planned to get there. Richard spent the night calling everyone he could think of who might know something. He called Autumn's teachers, her debate coach, her supervisor at the library, the parents of every friend whose number he had in his phone. Nobody had seen her. Nobody knew anything. Several people commented on how surprised they were, how unlike Autumn it was to cause her parents concern. She was such a good kid, they said. Always so responsible and mature. The comments, meant to be comforting, only amplified Richard's fear. If everyone agreed that this behavior was out of character for Autumn, then something terrible must have happened to make her act this way. The next morning, Friday, October 15th, the Parkers returned to the police station to follow up on the missing person report. They were assigned to Detective Sarah Holloway, a seasoned investigator in her early 40s, with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Detective Holloway took the case more seriously than Officer Chen had the night before. She had 2 teenage daughters of her own, and understood that while many missing teenager cases ended happily, some did not. She began by asking the Parkers to provide a recent photograph of Autumn, which they did immediately, handing over their favorite picture from Autumn's junior prom. In the photo, Autumn stood in front of their fireplace, wearing a deep blue dress, her hair styled in elegant curls, her smile wide and genuine. Detective Holloway also requested access to Autumn's room, her computer, her phone records, and her bank account. The Parkers agreed without hesitation, desperate for any help in finding their daughter. Holloway explained that she would need to interview Autumn's friends, teachers, and anyone else who had regular contact with her. She warned the Parkers that the investigation might uncover aspects of their daughter's life that they were unaware of, and that they should be prepared for potentially uncomfortable revelations. Teenagers, she explained gently, often lived double lives, presenting one version of themselves to their parents while maintaining entirely different identities with their peers. The detective's words proved prophetic. Over the next several days, as Holloway conducted interviews with Autumn's classmates and teachers, a more complex picture of the missing girl began to emerge. While everyone agreed that Autumn was an excellent student and generally well-behaved, several people mentioned that she had seemed stressed lately, more withdrawn than usual. Her debate coach noted that Autumn had been unusually quiet during recent practices, not participating with her typical enthusiasm. A girl named Melissa from her English class mentioned that Autumn had seemed sad sometimes, staring out the window during class with a distant expression on her face. Most significantly, Autumn's guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Donovan, revealed during her interview with Detective Holloway that Autumn had come to her office 3 weeks before her disappearance, asking about the possibility of taking a gap year before college. This was the first time Mrs. Donovan had heard such a request from Autumn, who had always been intensely focused on her academic future. When Mrs. Donovan had asked why she was considering this option, Autumn had been vague, mentioning something about feeling overwhelmed and needing time to figure out what she really wanted. Mrs. Donovan had encouraged her to discuss the idea with her parents, but Autumn had specifically asked her not to mention the conversation to them. She wanted to think about it more first, she had said. When Detective Holloway shared this information with Richard and Margaret Parker, they were stunned. Autumn had never mentioned anything about taking a gap year. She had been excited about college, or so they had thought. She had visited multiple campuses, carefully researched programs, and spent hours perfecting her applications. The idea that she might have been having doubts about her future, that she might have been feeling overwhelmed or uncertain, had never crossed their minds. She had seemed so confident, so sure of herself and her path. The detective also managed to access Autumn's social media accounts with the Parkers' permission and cooperation from the service providers. What she found there was revealing. While Autumn's Facebook page presented the image of a happy, successful teenager, her private messages told a different story. In conversations with a few close friends, Autumn had expressed frustration with her parents' expectations, calling them suffocating and controlling in several messages. She had written about feeling like she was living someone else's life, following a script that had been written for her before she was old enough to have any say in it. In one particularly telling message to a friend named Emma, sent just 3 days before her disappearance, Autumn had written, Sometimes I think about just getting in a car and driving somewhere nobody knows me, somewhere I could be anyone I want to be instead of who everyone expects me to be." When Detective Holloway showed these messages to the Parkers, Margaret began to cry. She had no idea her daughter felt this way. She thought they had a good relationship, an open relationship where Autumn could talk to them about anything. Richard sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with this other Autumn, the one who felt trapped and desperate for escape. They had only wanted the best for her, he said quietly. They had only pushed her because they knew she was capable of great things, because they wanted her to have opportunities they had never had. The investigation continued with increasing intensity. Detective Holloway obtained Autumn's cell phone records and discovered that she had made several calls to a number registered to a prepaid phone in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The number was no longer in service, and the phone had been purchased with cash at a convenience store, making it nearly impossible to trace. Autumn had also withdrawn $200 from her bank account on the afternoon of October 14th, just hours before she disappeared. The withdrawal had been made at an ATM near her school, and security footage showed Autumn alone, looking around nervously as she completed the transaction. The P's bank records also revealed something else interesting. Over the previous 2 months, Autumn had been making small cash withdrawals, never more than $40 or $50 at a time, but frequent enough that she had taken out nearly $500 total. When confronted with this information, the Parkers had no explanation. They had no idea what their daughter might have needed that much cash for, and the mystery only deepened their worry. Was she buying drugs? Was she involved with someone dangerous? Had she been planning her disappearance for weeks or even months? As the days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, the case began to attract media attention. Local news stations ran stories about the missing honor student, showing Autumn's prom picture and providing the tip line number. Margaret Parker made tearful appeals on camera, begging her daughter to come home, promising that they could work through whatever problems she was facing. Richard offered a reward of $10,000 for any information leading to Autumn's safe return. The community rallied around the family, organizing search parties that combed through local parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Hundreds of volunteers turned out, moved by the story of the seemingly perfect girl who had vanished without explanation. Despite all the efforts, no trace of Autumn was found. There were no confirmed sightings, no witnesses who remembered seeing her on the night of her disappearance, no forensic evidence to follow. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. Detective Holloway expanded the investigation beyond Asheville, sending out bulletins to police departments throughout North Carolina and neighboring states. She worked with the FBI, who offered assistance in cases involving missing minors, and Autumn's information was entered into national databases. 3 weeks after Autumn's disappearance, Margaret Parker made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. She had been going through her daughter's room again, something she did almost daily, touching Autumn's belongings and praying for her safe return. On this particular afternoon, she decided to look through some of Autumn's old books, the ones from childhood that she had kept on a shelf in her closet. Margaret pulled them down one by one, flipping through pages, looking at her daughter's handwritten notes and doodles from years past. When she opened an old copy of Anne of Green Gables, one of Autumn's favorites from middle school, several folded pieces of paper fell out from between the pages. Margaret unfolded the papers with trembling hands. They were journal entries, written in Autumn's distinctive handwriting, dated over the past 6 months. As Margaret read, her heart broke with every word. The entries detailed Autumn's growing unhappiness, her feeling of being trapped in a life she had not chosen, her resentment of her parents' constant expectations and demands. She wrote about the pressure to be perfect, to maintain her grades, to participate in the right activities, to get into the best colleges. She wrote about how exhausting it was to always be the good daughter, the model student, the girl who never made mistakes or caused trouble. But more than just venting frustration, the journal entries revealed something shocking. Autumn had been planning to run away. The entries from September detailed her preparations, her research into how to disappear, her careful accumulation of cash. She had been reading about people who had successfully started new lives under different identities, and she had been inspired by their stories. She wrote about her desire to go somewhere nobody knew her, to reinvent herself completely, to discover who she really was without the weight of everyone's expectations crushing her. In the most recent entry, dated October 13th, just one day before her disappearance, Autumn had written in detail about her plan. She had been communicating with someone she met online, a young woman named Rachel, who had successfully run away from her own controlling family 2 years earlier and had been living happily under a new identity in Oregon. Rachel had been coaching Autumn, giving her advice on how to disappear effectively, how to avoid being tracked, how to establish a new identity. Autumn had written that she had finally saved enough money to make her escape, and that she planned to leave the following night. She would tell her parents she was going to study with Jessica, then catch a bus out of Asheville to Charlotte, then another bus heading west. Rachel had offered to let Autumn stay with her initially while she got settled and found work. The journal entry ended with words that would haunt Margaret Parker for years to come. "I know Mom and Dad will be hurt, and I'm sorry for that, but I can't live like this anymore. I can't be their perfect daughter for one more day. I need to find out who I really am, what I really want, without them telling me who to be and what to choose. By the time they read this, I'll be gone, and I'll finally be free. Maybe someday they'll understand. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to come back and explain. But right now, I just need to disappear." Margaret called Detective Holloway immediately, and within hours, the investigation had taken on new direction and urgency. This was no longer a case of a missing teenager who might have been abducted or met with foul play. This was a runaway case, which in some ways was better news, but also presented its own challenges. If Autumn had successfully executed her plan to disappear, she could be anywhere by now, living under any name, and she might not want to be found. Detective Holloway worked with computer forensic specialists to trace Autumn's online communications and eventually found the conversations with Rachel, whose real name turned out to be Rachel Hoffman, age 22, living in Portland, Oregon. When police in Portland visited Rachel's apartment, she initially refused to cooperate, citing her belief that adults should have the right to make their own choices about where and how they lived. However, when detectives explained that Autumn was only 17 and therefore still a minor, and that Rachel could face serious legal consequences for helping her run away, she reluctantly provided information. Yes, Rachel confirmed. She had been communicating with Autumn for several months after Autumn had found her blog about starting over with a new identity. Yes, she had offered Autumn advice and had invited her to come to Portland. But Autumn had never arrived. Rachel had waited at the Portland bus station on October 16th, the date Autumn had said she would arrive. But Autumn had never shown up. Rachel had tried calling the prepaid phone number Autumn had been using, but it went straight to voicemail. She had assumed that Autumn had changed her mind or chickened out at the last minute, and she had not heard from her since. This information created a new mystery. If Autumn had been heading to Portland but had never arrived there, where was she? Had she changed her plans en route? Had something happened to her during her journey? Had she decided to go somewhere else entirely? Detective Holloway pulled bus station security footage from Asheville and confirmed that Autumn had indeed boarded a bus to Charlotte on the evening of October 14th at 8:30. The footage showed her buying a ticket with cash, wearing her gray hoodie and carrying a large backpack that appeared to be full. She looked nervous but determined as she boarded the bus. Security footage from the Charlotte bus station showed Autumn arriving there around 11:30 that night and purchasing a ticket for a bus heading west, though not to Portland, as she had originally planned. Instead, she had bought a ticket to Nashville, Tennessee. The bus had departed at 1:15 in the morning on October 15th. After that, the trail went cold. There was no record of Autumn arriving in Nashville, no footage of her at that bus station, no evidence of what she had done after getting off the bus. Detective Holloway worked with law enforcement in Nashville, and together they began checking hotels, shelters, and other places a teenage runaway might go. They showed Autumn's picture to bus station employees, hotel clerks, restaurant workers, anyone who might have seen her. Weeks went by without any breakthroughs. It seemed that Autumn had successfully achieved what she set out to do. She had disappeared. The Parkers were devastated by the revelation that their daughter had deliberately run away. The knowledge that she had been so unhappy, so desperate to escape them, cut deeper than any other possibility they had considered. Margaret blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for not recognizing how much pressure they had been putting on Autumn. Richard struggled with anger and hurt, feeling betrayed by the daughter he had loved and provided for so completely. They sought counseling to help them process their emotions and to understand where they had gone wrong. As November turned to December, the family tried to maintain hope while preparing for the possibility that they might never see Autumn again. They left her room exactly as it was, kept her phone number active, and maintained their social media accounts with regular posts pleading for her to contact them. Margaret wrote letters to her daughter that she posted on Facebook, telling Autumn that she was loved, that she was forgiven, that they only wanted to know she was safe. The breakthrough finally came on January 7th, 2010, nearly 3 months after Autumn's disappearance. A social worker in Knoxville, Tennessee, about 2 hours from Nashville, contacted Detective Holloway after reading about the case online. The social worker had been working with a young woman who called herself Lily Mitchell, who claimed to be 19 and looking for employment assistance. Something about the young woman had struck the social worker as off. She seemed younger than 19, more vulnerable, and there were inconsistencies in her story about her background. When the social worker happened to see an article about missing teenager Autumn Parker, she immediately recognized her as Lily Mitchell. Detective Holloway coordinated with Knoxville Police, and they located the apartment where the young woman calling herself Lily Mitchell was living with 2 roommates, both in their early 20s. When officers knocked on the door, Autumn answered. She was thinner than in her photographs. Her hair was shorter and dyed black, and she wore clothes that were markedly different from her previous preppy style. For a moment, she looked like she might run, but then her shoulders sagged, and she began to cry. It was over. Her desperate attempt at freedom had lasted exactly 85 days. Autumn was returned to her parents, who flew to Knoxville immediately upon receiving the news that she had been found. The reunion was emotional and complicated, filled with relief, joy, anger, hurt, and confusion. Margaret held her daughter and sobbed, while Richard stood nearby, unable to speak through his own tears. Autumn apologized over and over, saying she never meant to hurt them so badly, that she had just felt so trapped and had not known any other way out. In the days and weeks that followed, the full story of Autumn's time away emerged slowly through family therapy sessions that the Parkers began attending together. Autumn explained that she had gotten off the bus in Nashville as planned, but had immediately felt overwhelmed and frightened. She had not been prepared for how difficult it would be to navigate life alone with limited resources. She had spent her first night in Nashville at a cheap motel, using precious cash for a room where she barely slept, terrified of every sound. The next day, she had wandered around the city, trying to figure out her next move, and had eventually struck up a conversation with a young woman at a coffee shop who mentioned that Knoxville might be a better place for her to start over, as it was smaller and less expensive than Nashville. Autumn had taken a bus to Knoxville and had found a room to rent in a house with 2 other young people who asked few questions as long as she paid her share of the rent on time. She had gotten a job working at a retail store, using fake identification that she had purchased from someone she met through a friend of her roommates. The ID said she was Lily Mitchell, age 19, and while it was not particularly convincing, her employer had not looked too carefully, desperate for help during the holiday shopping season. For those 3 months, Autumn had lived an entirely different life. She worked at the store during the day, came home to her small room at night, and tried to figure out what she wanted. She had not made many friends, had not gone out much, had mostly kept to herself. She described feeling both liberated and lost, happy to be free from her parents' expectations, but uncertain about who she was without them. She had thought constantly about her family, wondering if they were okay, if they hated her, if they were even looking for her. She had wanted to call them so many times, but had been afraid that they would force her to come home before she was ready. Eventually, Autumn explained, she had realized that running away had not solved her problems the way she thought it would. She was still the same person with the same insecurities and uncertainties, just in a different location. And more than that, she had realized how much she missed her family, how much she wanted to make things right, even if she was not sure how to do that. When the social worker had begun asking questions, part of Autumn had been relieved, hoping that it might force the confrontation she knew needed to happen, but did not have the courage to initiate herself. The Parkers were heartbroken to learn about the conditions their daughter had been living in, working minimum wage in a retail store and living in a house with strangers, all because she had felt she could not be herself in their home. Through therapy, they began to understand the ways in which their well-intentioned parenting had become oppressive to Autumn. They had projected their own dreams and ambitions onto her without considering what she wanted for herself. They had equated love with control, believing that if they just guided her carefully enough, pushed her hard enough, she would achieve everything they had never been able to achieve themselves. Autumn, for her part, came to understand that she could have communicated her feelings to her parents instead of running away. She learned in therapy that her parents' high expectations had come from a place of love, even if they had been misguided in their expression of it. She realized that by running away, she had caused terrible pain to people who loved her deeply, and that there had been other ways to establish her independence and identity that would not have been so destructive. The legal consequences of Autumn's disappearance were relatively minor. Because she had run away voluntarily and had not been involved in any criminal activities beyond using false identification, there were no charges filed against her. The person who had sold her the fake ID was investigated, but because Autumn refused to identify them specifically, that case went nowhere. Rachel Hoffman in Portland faced no charges, as authorities determined that she had not actively helped Autumn run away, had only offered advice and a potential place to stay, and had not seen or communicated with Autumn after she failed to arrive as planned. The emotional consequences, however, were significant and long-lasting. The Parker family spent months in intensive therapy, working to rebuild trust and establish new patterns of communication. Richard and Margaret had to learn to loosen their grip, to allow Autumn to make her own decisions, even when those decisions were not the ones they would have chosen for her. Autumn had to learn to trust her parents again, to believe that they could love and accept her, even if she did not follow the exact path they had envisioned for her. Autumn decided to defer her college acceptances for a year, choosing to stay home and work while continuing therapy and figuring out what she really wanted to study. Her parents supported this decision, though it was difficult for them to let go of the timeline they had imagined for their daughter's life. She got a job at a local bookstore and began writing poetry. something she had never had time for during her years of academic achievement and endless extracurricular activities. She reconnected with old friends and made new ones, allowing herself to be more authentic and open about her struggles and uncertainties. The case was officially closed in February 2010, with Autumn's safe return marking its resolution. But Detective Holloway knew, as did the Parker family, that the real work was just beginning. The case had revealed fundamental fractures in the family's relationships, misunderstandings that had been building for years, and patterns of communication that needed to be completely rebuilt. It would take time, patience, and tremendous effort from everyone involved to heal from what had happened. Margaret Parker continued to attend a support group for parents of runaway teens, where she shared her story and learned from others who had gone through similar experiences. She spoke openly about the ways she and Richard had contributed to Autumn's unhappiness, not as a form of self-flagellation, but as a genuine effort to understand and grow. She became an advocate for mental health awareness in teenagers and for more open communication between parents and children about expectations and pressures. Richard Parker struggled more visibly with the aftermath of Autumn's disappearance. He had difficulty letting go of his anger and hurt, feeling that his daughter's actions had been a personal rejection of everything he had tried to provide for her. But over time, with therapy and with Autumn's patient efforts to explain her perspective, he too began to soften and understand. He learned to listen without immediately offering solutions or advice, and he discovered that sometimes his daughter just needed him to be present and supportive rather than directive. Autumn herself carried scars from her experience that would take years to fully process. She had nightmares about her time in Knoxville, about the fear and loneliness she had felt, about the desperation that had driven her to make such a drastic choice. She struggled with guilt over the pain she had caused her parents, and with shame over some of the choices she had made while she was gone. But she also recognized that the experience, as traumatic as it had been for everyone involved, had ultimately forced necessary conversations and changes that might never have happened otherwise. The story of Autumn Parker's disappearance became something of a cautionary tale in Asheville, discussed in parent groups and school counselor offices as an example of how even seemingly perfect families could harbor deep problems. It highlighted the immense pressure placed on teenagers to succeed academically and the importance of checking in with young people about their mental health and happiness, not just their achievements. It demonstrated how easily the line between supportive parenting and controlling parenting could be crossed, and how devastating the consequences could be when that line was not carefully monitored. By the fall of 2010, exactly 1 year after her disappearance, Autumn was enrolled in a state university about an hour from Asheville, studying creative writing rather than the pre-law program her parents had once envisioned for her. She came home most weekends, and the visits were no longer filled with tension about grades and achievements, but with genuine connection and conversation. The Parkers had learned to ask different questions. Not, "How are your grades?" but, "Are you happy?" Not, "Are you working hard enough?" but, "Are you taking care of yourself?" The shift was subtle but profound, representing a fundamental change in their priorities and values. The emotional scars remained for all of them. Margaret still sometimes woke in the night, panicked, checking to make sure Autumn's car was in the driveway. Richard still struggled with moments of hurt when he remembered that his daughter had preferred to live with strangers rather than come to him with her problems. Autumn still dealt with anxiety and occasional depression, working with a therapist to develop healthy coping mechanisms and to continue processing her experiences. But they had all learned, slowly and painfully, that love means accepting people as they are rather than molding them into who you want them to be. The case files on Autumn Parker's disappearance sat in the Asheville Police Department archives, officially closed but representing so much more than just another runaway teenager, returned home. They represented a family torn apart and painstakingly put back together, a girl's desperate bid for freedom that had nearly destroyed her, and the long, difficult road to healing that followed. Detective Holloway kept a copy of Autumn's prom picture in her desk drawer, not as a memento of a successful case, but as a reminder that things are rarely as perfect as they appear, and that sometimes the people who seem to have it all together are the ones struggling most desperately beneath the surface. Years later, when asked about that time in her life, Autumn Parker would speak carefully and thoughtfully about the choices she had made. She never fully defended her decision to run away, acknowledging the harm it had caused and the better ways she could have handled her situation. But she also never completely apologized for it either, recognizing that the desperation she had felt was real and valid, even if her response to it had been flawed. She had needed to break free, even if the way she had done it had been destructive. The key, she learned, was finding ways to establish independence and identity that did not require complete destruction of the relationships and structures that had shaped her. The story of where Autumn went had a concrete answer. She went to Knoxville, Tennessee, where she lived under an assumed name for 3 months before being found. But the deeper question of where the real Autumn had gone, the happy girl who had once seemed so content with her perfect life, had a more complex answer. That Autumn had never really existed except in her parents' perceptions and hopes. The real Autumn had been there all along, struggling and suffocating, trying desperately to figure out who she was beneath the weight of everyone's expectations. Finding her way back from that metaphorical disappearance proved to be the longer and more important journey, one that continued long after she physically returned home to Asheville.